Law 31. Control the options. Get others to play with the cards you deal. Judgment. The best deceptions are the ones that seem to give the other person a choice. Your victims feel they are in control, but are actually your puppets. Give people options that come out in your favor, whichever one they choose. Force them to make choices between the lesser of two evils, both of which serve your purpose. Put them on the horns of a dilemma. They are gored wherever they turn. Observance of the law. From early in his reign, Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, had to confront an unpleasant reality. The country desperately needed reform, but he lacked the power to push it through. The greatest limit to his authority came from the boyars, the Russian princely class that dominated the country and terrorized the peasantry. In 1553, at the age of 23, Ivan fell ill. Lying in bed, nearing death, he asked the boyars to swear allegiance to his son as the new Tsar. Some hesitated, some even refused. Then and there, Ivan saw he had no power over the boyars. He recovered from his illness, but he never forgot the lesson. The boyars were out to destroy him, and indeed, in the years to come, many of the most powerful of them defected to Russia's main enemies, Poland and Lithuania, where they plotted their return and the overthrow of the Tsar. Even one of Ivan's closest friends, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, suddenly turned against him, defecting to Lithuania in 1564 and becoming the strongest of Ivan's enemies. When Kurbsky began raising troops for an invasion, the royal dynasty seemed suddenly more precarious than ever. With émigré nobles fomenting invasion from the west, Tartars bearing down from the east, and the boyars stirring up trouble within the country, Russia's vast size made it a nightmare to defend. In whatever direction Ivan struck, he would leave himself vulnerable on the other side. Only if he had absolute power could he deal with this many-headed hydra, and he had no such power. Ivan brooded until the morning of December 3rd, 1564, when the citizens of Moscow awoke to a strange sight. Hundreds of sleds filled the square before the Kremlin, loaded with the Tsar's treasures and with provisions for the entire court. They watched in disbelief as the Tsar and his court boarded the sleds and left town. Without explaining why, he established himself in a village south of Moscow. For an entire month, a kind of terror gripped the capital, for the Muscovites feared that Ivan had abandoned them to the bloodthirsty boyars. Shops closed up, and riotous mobs gathered daily. Finally, on January 3rd of 1565, a letter arrived from the Tsar, explaining that he could no longer bear the boyars' betrayals and had decided to abdicate once and for all. Read aloud in public, the letter had a startling effect. Merchants and commoners blamed the boyars for Ivan's decision and took to the streets, terrifying the nobility with their fury. Soon a group of delegates representing the church, the princes, and the people made the journey to Ivan's village and begged the Tsar, in the name of the Holy Land of Russia, to return to the throne. Ivan listened, but would not change his mind. After days of hearing their pleas, however, he offered his subjects a choice. Either they grant him absolute powers to govern as he pleased, with no interference from the boyars, or they find a new leader. Faced with a choice between civil war and the acceptance of despotic power, almost every sector of Russian society opted for a strong Tsar, calling for Ivan's return to Moscow and the restoration of law and order. In February, with much celebration, Ivan returned to Moscow. The Russians could no longer complain if he behaved dictatorially. They had given him this power themselves. Interpretation. Withdrawal and disappearance are classic ways of controlling the options. You give people a sense of how things will fall apart without you, and you offer them a choice. I stay away and you suffer the consequences, or I return under circumstances that I dictate. In this method of controlling people's options, they choose the option that gives you power because the alternative is just too unpleasant. You force their hand, but indirectly. They seem to have a choice. Whenever people feel they have a choice, they walk into your trap that much more easily. Keys to power. Words like freedom, options, and choice evoke a power of possibility far beyond the reality of the benefits they entail. When examined closely, the choices we have in the marketplace, in elections, in our jobs, tend to have noticeable limitations. They are often a matter of a choice simply between A and B, with the rest of the alphabet out of the picture. Yet, as long as the faintest mirage of choice flickers on, we rarely focus on the missing options. We choose to believe that the game is fair and that we have our freedom. We prefer not to think too much about the depth of our liberty to choose. This supplies the clever and cunning with enormous opportunities for deception. For people who are choosing between alternatives find it hard to believe they are being manipulated or deceived. They cannot see that you are allowing them a small amount of free will in exchange for a much more powerful imposition of your own will. Setting up a narrow range of choices, then, should always be a part of your deceptions. There is a saying, if you can get the bird to walk into the cage on its own, it will sing that much more prettily. The following are among the most common forms of controlling the options. Color the choices. This was a favored technique of Henry Kissinger. As President Nixon's Secretary of State, Kissinger considered himself better informed than his boss and believed that in most situations he could make the best decision on his own. But if he tried to determine policy, he would offend, or perhaps enrage, a notoriously insecure man. So Kissinger would propose 3 or 4 choices of action for each situation, and would present them in such a way that the one he preferred always seemed the best solution compared to the others. Time after time, Nixon fell for the bait, never suspecting that he was moving where Kissinger pushed him. This is an excellent device to use on the insecure master. Force the resistor. This is a good technique to use on children and other willful people who enjoy doing the opposite of what you ask them to. Push them to choose what you want them to do by appearing to advocate the opposite. Alter the playing field. In the 1860s, John D. Rockefeller set out to create an oil monopoly. If he tried to buy up the smaller oil companies, they would figure out what he was doing and fight back. Instead, he began secretly buying up the railway companies that transported the oil. When he then attempted to take over a particular company and met with resistance, he reminded them of their dependence on the rails. Refusing them shipping or simply raising their fees could ruin their business. Rockefeller altered the playing field so that the only options the small oil producers had were the ones he gave them. In this tactic, your opponents know their hand is being forced, but it doesn't matter. The technique is effective against those who resist at all costs. The shrinking options. The late 19th century art dealer Ambrose Vollard perfected this technique. Customers would come to Vollard's shop to see some Cézannes. He would show 3 paintings, neglect to mention a price, and pretend to doze off. The visitors would have to leave without deciding. They would usually come back the next day to see the paintings again, but this time Vollard would pull out less interesting works, pretending he thought they were the same ones. The baffled customers would look at the new offerings, leave to think them over, and return yet again. Once again, the same thing would happen. Vollard would show paintings of lesser quality still. Finally, the buyers would realize they had better grab what he was showing them because tomorrow they would have to settle for something worse, perhaps at even higher prices. A variation on this technique is to raise the price every time the buyer hesitates and another day goes by. This is an excellent negotiating ploy to use on the chronically indecisive, who will fall for the idea that they are getting a better deal today than if they wait till tomorrow. The weak man on the precipice. The weak are the easiest to maneuver by controlling their options. Cardinal de Retz, the great 17th century provocateur, served as an unofficial assistant to the Duke of Orleans, who was notoriously indecisive. It was a constant struggle to convince the Duke to take action. He would hem and haw, weigh the options, and wait until the last moment, giving everyone around him an ulcer. But Retz discovered a way to handle him. He would describe all sorts of dangers, exaggerating them as much as possible, until the Duke saw a yawning abyss in every direction except one, the one Retz was pushing him to take. This tactic is similar to color the choices, but with the weak, you have to be more aggressive. Work on their emotions, use fear and terror to propel them into action. Try reason, and they will always find a way to procrastinate. The horns of a dilemma. This idea was demonstrated by General William Sherman's infamous march through Georgia during the American Civil War. Although the Confederates knew what direction Sherman was heading in, they never knew if he would attack from the left or the right, for he divided his army into two wings, and if the rebels retreated from one wing, they found themselves facing the other. This is a classic trial lawyer's technique. The lawyer leads the witness to decide between two possible explanations of an event, both of which poke a hole in their story. They have to answer the lawyer's questions, but whatever they say, they hurt themselves. The key to this move is to strike quickly, deny the victim the time to think of an escape. As they wriggle between the horns of the dilemma, they dig their own grave. Understand, in your struggles with your rivals, it will often be necessary for you to hurt them. And if you are clearly the agent of their punishment, expect a counterattack. Expect revenge. If, however, they seem to themselves to be the agents of their own misfortune, they will submit quietly. When Ivan left Moscow for his rural village, the citizens asking him to return agreed to his demand for absolute power. Over the years to come, they resented him less for the terror he unleashed on the country, because, after all, they had granted him his power themselves. This is why it is always good to allow your victims their choice of poison and to cloak your involvement in providing it to them as far as possible.